Good morning, Snipes Academy. It is Monday, February 22nd. I'm Mr. Yates, and this is Snipes Daily News. All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a good sunny weekend, albeit a little chilly. Today's weather will be a little bit warmer. It's a high of 62, but there's a high likelihood of some afternoon showers. For this day in history, we're going to talk about George Washington. George Washington, the first president of the United States of America, was born on February 22nd, 1732. Fun fact about George Washington, he actually has two birthdays. So when he was born, the Americas used it was before America was a country, but the American colonies used a calendar system called the Julian calendar, and they later converted to the British calendar that we use today. According to the Julian calendar, he was actually born on February 11th. But according to the Gregorian calendar, which we use today, it's February 22nd. So, George Washington is best known as the first president of the United States, but he was also the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Part of his success as a general, however, was not necessarily related to his prowess as a military commander and strategist, but about his ability to keep his troops' morale up and to keep them fighting. He had a very magnetic presence as a person. He was a great speaker, but also he had a commanding presence, as he was quite a bit larger than other men. George Washington was about 6'1" tall, which is about my height, so that might not seem super tall, but at the time the average male height in America was around 5'7" or 5'8", which is about the height of Miss Faison. So if you look at Miss Faison and you look at me, that's the difference between normal men during that time period and George Washington. Another good example would be like if the normal height was my height, George Washington would be Mr. Bowles' height, which is pretty tall. The Revolutionary War ended at the Battle of Yorktown with the surrender of General Lord Cornwallis. And after that, George Washington made his way back to Mount Vernon in Virginia. However, he was quickly called to a meeting of Congress. Congress wanted him to be the president of the United States. George Washington actually did not want to be president of the United States. He wanted to return to the quiet life in Mount Vernon, but there was a lot of public support for him, and so upon their insistence, he ran. And he won the most votes by a very large margin. The next most was a man named John Adams. So John Adams became the first vice president of the United States. Back then, the person with the second most votes was the vice president. Back then, he was the president of a pretty small country. It had 11 states and about 4 million people. Some of his major accomplishments, though, were in the people he picked to help him run the country. Thomas Jefferson was selected as his Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton was selected as his Secretary of the Treasury. So what party did he run for? Was he a Democrat? Was he a Republican? Actually, neither. George Washington didn't really have a political party. His closest affiliation was with the Federalist Party, but he wasn't really a part of the Federalist Party. Lastly, George Washington only served 2 4-year terms as president. They had no rules about this back then, and he could have served probably as many as he wanted to. He probably could have served until he died. But by establishing this tradition, which would later become law, he made it possible for the nation to not have an oligarchic control of one person. Rather have a person who's voted in every so often so that you don't have this monarchy situation. So one of my favorite quotes from George Washington was one he said about free speech. I'm a huge fan of free speech. This is probably my favorite George Washington quote. If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to the slaughter. Now let's move on to some birthdays. We only have one birthday today, Ja'Kiah Griffin in 5th grade. Ja'Kiah is turning 11. So say happy birthday to Ja'Kiah if you see her. And that about does it for us today, guys. So I hope you stay safe, and I will see you soon. This is Snipes Daily News.